Tanji Johnson is a successful businesswoman, but when she tried to enter an elite store, she was humiliated by the salesperson, unaware that she was his new boss. How she took revenge will surprise even those who have seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. Tanji Johnson was a confident woman. At 38, she had achieved what many only dream of. She was a successful businesswoman and a respected figure in her field. But what she experienced in one of the city's most expensive stores made her reflect on how deeply racial prejudices were rooted in the most unexpected places. When she entered the designer clothing store on the main street, her gaze lingered on the expensive displays. Every item in this boutique was a work of art, and although Tanji wasn't planning to make a purchase, she just wanted to see these things up close. She wasn't used to walking through elite stores, where she was always met with polite but cold looks. However, today, inspired by a new project, she thought, why not? At the entrance, she was greeted by a young salesperson, Michael, 25, white, with neatly trimmed light hair and a sharp suit. When his eyes met hers, he barely suppressed a smirk. He was sure that she was just a regular woman who clearly didn't belong in this high-end store. There was something mocking in his gaze, but he quickly hid it behind a professional mask. "Good afternoon, madam. How may I assist you?" His voice was cold and formal. Tanji felt a slight flush of embarrassment on her cheeks. In her simple yet elegant dress and shoes, she clearly didn't fit the image the store valued. But, keeping her emotions in check, she calmly replied, "Just looking, thank you." She slowly began moving along the displays, her eyes scanning the price tags and items, exuding calm and confidence. Michael, for his part, continued to keep his distance, not approaching her with offers, as he usually did with customers who, in his eyes, fit the profile of a potential buyer. Instead, he whispered with mild sarcasm to his colleague, oblivious to the fact that Tanji could hear everything. "Look who's here. I think she's looking for something simpler." Tanji didn't know how to react. The insult wasn't direct, but it was clear enough. Her heart tightened with pain, but she wasn't about to show Michael that his words had affected her. Instead, she decided to test how far his arrogance would go. Tanji continued to browse the store, doing her best not to show her vulnerability. She approached the cashier to make a purchase, and that's when he came up to her. A smile appeared on Michael's face, but there was coldness in his eyes. "May I help you?" He looked at her again, seeing her the way he deemed fit. Tanji, realizing that he was still ignoring her, decided it was enough. She quickly grabbed her things and headed for the exit. But before leaving, she turned around and said, "You don't know who you're dealing with, but I promise you this is not over." The next day, determined, Tanji returned to the same store, but this time she wasn't just a visitor. She was the new owner of the company that had acquired this brand. Dressed in a high-end designer suit that highlighted her status, she felt her confidence grow. This was her moment to take revenge, not just for herself, but for all those who had ever been humiliated in such places. When Tanji entered the store, Michael was busy at the cashier. He didn't notice her right away, but as soon as he looked up, his face changed. He remembered her, the same woman he had once humiliated. He tried to hide his awkwardness, but it was clear that he immediately realized something was off. Doubt flashed in his eyes as he took in her new stylish suit. "May I help you?" he asked, but his voice no longer sounded as confident. Tanji waited a couple of seconds, letting him process who was standing in front of him. Then she opened her purse and pulled out documents confirming her status as the owner of the company. Michael's face froze in an expression that couldn't be described in words. He felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Tanji calmly placed the papers in front of him, taking her time. "I'm your new boss. I acquired this brand. Everything you said yesterday was recorded. I'm very sorry you didn't recognize me earlier." Michael tried to apologize, his face pale from the realization that his behavior had put him in a very awkward position. He was stunned and confused. All he could utter was, I didn't know who you were." But Tanji wasn't in the mood for pity. She wasn't going to just forgive him. She decided to hold a meeting and explain to the entire team how important it was to respect all clients, regardless of their appearance or background. The salespeople who had overheard their conversation stood frozen. realizing that their colleague had just made a mistake that could cost him his job. The whole store staff began to understand how, through bias and ignorance, Michael had put not only himself, but also their business in danger. Tanji turned to them. "You're all here to serve customers, not judge them based on their clothing or skin color. We must all be equal in the face of this brand. And if any of you think that someone can be a lesser customer just because of their appearance, I ask you to think about your future." Michael, pale, tried to apologize, but Tanji interrupted him. "Apologies won't help, Michael. We need to move forward." After exposing Michael, Tanji decided her story couldn't remain in the shadows. She knew her experience was just a drop in the ocean of racial discrimination, and she had to do everything to make this moment a significant point in the fight against prejudice. She knew that if nothing changed, the cycle would continue. She couldn't let this be forgotten. Tanji posted about what happened on social media. She shared her experience of being humiliated in the store, which, as it turned out, was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of racial discrimination within the fashion industry. Within hours, her post went viral. People started sharing the message, discussing her actions, and supporting her right to be respected. Hundreds of comments condemned Michael and his behavior, expressing outrage. Tanji felt how her decision to go public was changing public opinion. Her story became the foundation for discussions on racial bias and discrimination in the fashion industry. The media began covering her post, and soon her face became a symbol of the fight against injustice in such institutions as elite stores and designer brands. Michael found himself at the center of a scandal. His apologies no longer seemed sincere in the eyes of the public, and although he admitted his mistake, he couldn't avoid the consequences. Colleagues who had once laughed at Tanji began distancing themselves from him. Salespeople realized they needed to rethink their approach to customers, and that bias would no longer be part of their work. Michael was sent for diversity training, and Tanji decided to personally meet with every employee of the store to help them reconsider their attitudes. Though he apologized to her, Tanji decided that it wasn't enough. Training on respect and inclusivity became mandatory for all employees. Michael also became part of this process, but now as someone who had to go through a process of realization himself. A few weeks later, when things had calmed down and public attention had lessened, Tanji invited Michael for a private meeting. She decided to give him one last chance. She knew that a mistake could be corrected, but only if the person realized where they went wrong. When Michael arrived, he, like all these days, seemed nervous but ready to talk. Tanji looked at him calmly and said, "You made a serious mistake, but what matters is that you recognize it. You've come a long way, and I'm ready to help you through this process if you want." Michael nodded silently and began to speak about how ashamed he was of his behavior. He acknowledged that he had been part of the system of bias and was now ready to learn in order to be better. "I understand what respect means, and I'm ready to be part of the team that will fight bias in this industry." Tanji smiled. She felt that this victory was not just hers, but for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. The story that began with humiliation ended with a transformation of an entire system. Tanji realized how her own fight for justice had not only changed her, but also impacted those around her. This moment had become a turning point in her life,